Welcome to Pod Save America. I'm John Favreau.
I'm John Lovett. I'm Tommy Vitor.
I'm Dan Pfeiffer.
We are back from Las Vegas, where we covered the caucus like the good journalists that we are.
Hey, nice to see you. How are you?
Enjoyed that podcast.
I enjoyed it too. That was fun.
So you guys here to cover the
Cover the caucus tomorrow.
With 96% of precincts reporting, it was a blowout for Bernie Sanders, who won with 47% of the vote and will get an estimated 24 of the state's 36 delegates. So let's talk about Bernie's big victory. He won every demographic except voters over 65 and black voters, where he finished a pretty close second to Joe Biden. Bernie won men and women, college and non-college educated voters, union and non-union households, all voters under 65, very liberal voters, somewhat liberal voters, tied Biden and Buttigieg among self-described moderate and conservative voters. He won independents. He won first-time caucus goers, who made up 50% of the turnout. And he dominated among Latinos with 51% of the vote. Here's a clip of Bernie's election night speech, which he actually delivered in Texas.
Now, Trump and his friends think they are going to win this election. They think they're going to win this election by dividing our people up based on the color of their skin or where they were born or their religion or their sexual orientation. We are going to win because we are doing exactly the opposite. We're bringing our people together.
How significant do you guys think the coalition that Bernie put together in Nevada is?
You know, I think Bernie's strength with Latinx voters could be the most important thing we learn in this primary. It's truly impressive. They've been organizing early in Latino communities. They've been doing it in California as well. They've already spent $1 million in Spanish language ads in California alone. So that's something they've put time and effort into. I think that he's trying to build a coalition that is diverse and broad. I mean, the only place he's not doing well so far is voters over 65, which still seems to be Biden's wheelhouse.
Yeah. And P2.
Yeah, P2. So, look, I mean, it's impressive.
I'd also just add, too, that, you know, it is true that Biden, according to the entry and exit polls, won among African Americans, but Bernie also did really well among black voters, and Amy Klobuchar and Mayor Pete did abysmally. And the time has now run out for the two of them to make the claim that those voters are going to give them a chance, give them a look. We're here. You know, South Carolina is this Saturday. Super Tuesday is the Tuesday after that. You cannot be the Democratic nominee if you are not exciting and turning out African-American voters. And as of right now, it has really been those two candidates, Bernie and Biden, who have so far been able to do that.
Dan, what did you think about Bernie's coalition? Obviously, you can't, or at least it's fraught to draw parallels between coalitions that turn out in a primary and the general election, but does it tell us anything about sort of the coalition that Bernie can put together?
Well, it's also fraught to draw huge assumptions from, or draw huge conclusions from entrance polls in a caucus with a sample size this small.
Yeah,
I mean, the
right.
thing that's sort of stunning is Bernie's going to win with nearly half the delegates by getting, I think when the votes are counted, less than 40,000 Nevadans to choose him. Mm-hmm. Now, this is not one of the situations that you saw in 2016 where Bernie would crush in the caucus, and then if there was a non-delegate awarding primary later, Hillary would win by like 15 points. I think Bernie would have won a Nevada primary as well, and maybe by at least the margin he had in the first preference vote, which was like, I think 30-18 or something over Biden.
Yeah.
Or 34-18 over Biden. I think the most significant thing that we saw here is that Bernie won among voters who prized electability most. And that is the journey that Bernie has gone through when he was at 16% in the national polling in December to 29% in the national polling average where he is today, is he has convinced a lot of Democrats that he can win. And the other Democrats have not done a good job of convincing voters that he can't win or that they would do a better job of beating Trump than he would. And so he's been able to bring all of these groups together. And in terms of his general election coalition, the real sign of hope is his strength among Latino voters. And if he could replicate that in Arizona, he has the potential to put that state into play.
Yeah, I want to echo that point about Latino voters too. And the one piece of research I haven't seen, and I don't know if anyone has it yet, is did Bernie Sanders and his campaign sort of register new Latino voters who hadn't voted before? Are they expanding the electorate among Latino voters, or are they just dominating within the Latino voters who usually show up and vote in Democratic primaries and caucuses? I think that remains to be seen. But, you know, the New York Times said many Latinos who showed up at the caucuses wearing Sanders buttons and stickers said his campaign was the only one they had ever heard from. Some of our friends at Equus Research, who do a lot of good polling in the Latino community, have a lot of research from the last week that shows that Bernie now has the highest favorability among Latino voters of any of the Democratic candidates, not just they did some polling in Nevada, but also in Colorado and some other states with heavy Latino population. So I do think that's something worth watching, not just for his strength in the primary, but a potential looking for signs of potential strength in the general election. And to me, that hinges more on, you know, are they actually bringing in new Latinos into the electorate who tend to be sporadic voters and tend to be difficult to organize because Democrats haven't spent enough time trying to organize them. So I do think that's something to sort of watch as we go along. You know, quite a growing number of establishment Democrats, centrist Democrats, never Trump Republicans, MSNBC media personalities, and other blue checkmark pundits are, to put it mildly, freaking the fuck out over the prospect of a Bernie Sanders nomination, mainly for two reasons. One, he's a self-described democratic socialist who they believe is too ideologically extreme to win a general election. And two, they're worried he'll also cost Democrats the House, the Senate, and other down-ballot races. Matt Bennett of the centrist Democratic group The Third Way told Politico, quote, "In 30-plus years of politics, I've never seen this level of doom." And just to give you an example of how some folks are reacting to this, we have two MSNBC clips from Saturday night with one from Democratic strategist James Carville and one from Hardball host Chris Matthews.
The happiest person right now, it's about 1:15 Moscow time. This thing is going very well for Vladimir Putin. I promise you. He's probably staying up watching us right now. How you doing, Vlad?
That's absolutely right. And James, there's reporting that that's exactly what the intelligence agencies think is going on. I mean, the Sanders campaign was briefed that Putin is helping him or plans to help him in the primary. Amazing.
And I don't think Sanders wants Putin to help. The only reason, why would Vladimir Putin be helping Bernie Sanders? Of course, because he wants Donald Trump to win. I mean, it's a straight line, and I don't think that the Sanders campaign in any way is collusion or collaboration. I think they don't like this story, but the story is a fact. And the reason that the story is a fact is Putin is doing everything that he can to help Trump, including trying to get Bernie Sanders the Democratic nomination. If you remember when Bernie ran in 2016, his chief strategist was Paul Manafort's sidekick in the Ukraine. Mm-hmm. I mean, this thing just didn't start right now. And it's something that people need to know about. They need to be made aware of it. The candidates on the debate stage in South Carolina on Monday night need to quit attacking each other and start talking about where this country is and how do you push it forward under some real choices that Democrats have to make.
And let's hear Chris Matthews.
Bernie, on the other hand, did his job. He got more than a majority of that 67%. That is the name of the game. It is pretty much over unless that changes. I was reading last night, Brian, I know you're a history guy too. I'm reading last night about the fall of France in the summer of 1940. And the general, Renault, calls up Churchill and says, "It's over." And Churchill said, "How can it be? You got the greatest army in Europe. How can it be over?" He said, "It's over." So I had that suppressed feeling. I can't be as wild as Carville, but he is damn smart.
Wow.
So honestly, guys, that was just the tip of the iceberg. Because this morning, it's really everyone's gone into full freakout mode, which, you know, confused me for two reasons. We can talk about whether the concern is warranted or not, and I think there's a good debate about that. I'm more surprised that it took everyone this long. Like, we've been saying here, at least for the last month, that Bernie Sanders is the front runner for the nomination. And it doesn't seem like a lot of people actually believe that was true until now. Like, I
guess Chris Matthews comparing a Jewish American to Hitler is a lagging indicator.
So let's start with, I mean, forget about the sort of the craziest freakouts. I mean, what do you guys think about the worry that Bernie is a democratic socialist who's too ideologically extreme to win? Like, is there something to those concerns?
Yes, I'm worried about it. I remain worried about it. I've been worried about it. and I think it's a challenge that he's going to have to face. It's worth noting that last week Quinnipiac had a poll that showed Bernie beating Trump in Michigan and Pennsylvania, and I think that same poll corrected a Wisconsin result that freaked out a lot of people and showed that actually Wisconsin is tracking a lot closer to those other states. Now, Bernie has not faced a deluge of RNC and Trump campaign attack ads that will be as brutal and vicious as possible, but every campaign will face that. So I think we need to be honest that this is a challenging general election matchup. But, you know, look, I'd love to address the Putin thing at the right time because I think that's crazy. I also think Chris's history is insane, so we could talk about that too. But I do think, like, the pundit class meltdown is so absurd.
People are losing their fucking minds on Twitter. We'll get to it. But man, it seems like there are a lot of people who think it's free to talk about how dangerous Bernie Sanders is the nominee while not saying why they believe one of the alternatives must be the alternatives. There's a lot of people who want to be very critical of Bernie Sanders without telling Amy, Pete, Biden, Steyer, Bloomberg, any of them to drop out.
Yeah, or saying
Warren,
which one
of course,
they favor.
but they
saying
which
like.
one they favor.
Yeah, you think if people were scared about Bernie, then today we'd see a lot of I love Joe Biden or I love Pete Buttigieg or I love Elizabeth Warren, but it's a lot more just
because
like,
they can't
because they don't know.
Well, they don't know, but also I think you know, there's no one alternative that's obviously more electable than Bernie Sanders. They all have liabilities, so it's easier to attack Bernie Sanders and explain how worried they are about Bernie Sanders than it is to explain why their personal choice of candidate is a better bet. I think that's just much harder to do.
Anyone who thinks that there's some monolithic Democratic establishment that pulls strings back in D.C., just look at this clown car of candidates who are all losing their fucking minds about Bernie Sanders winning, and not one of them can get it together to say, hey, you, and you drop out so that these other people can become an alternative and actually take Bernie Sanders on. They are setting it up perfectly to ensure that Bernie Sanders gets the nomination. So maybe we stop pulling back the curtain and looking for the Wizard of Oz and instead realize that
it's just a bunch of people.
Goobers.
A bunch of people with different ideas.
Here we are.
and some pretty big egos. There's also something else going on too, which it long precedes Bernie, and it in part is a result of the shift of Republicans to this more radical extreme direction, which is cable news generally is much more comfortable and accustomed to the sound of vicious, right-wing, revanchist, extremist, radical policies and people than it is to even moderate Democratic leftists who, outside of the United States in places like Europe, are part of the mainstream. The narrow band of what is mainstream to exclude a lot of people who have Bernie Sanders views has made it, I think, more comfortable for people on television to freak the fuck out over Bernie Sanders because it just seems so crazy to them. And that's just a small part of it that was bugging me.
Yeah.
Dan, what are your concerns? What's your level of concern? Let's do that.
I mean, it's high, but I think if one of our other candidates was right now in this like pole position where they were potentially about to become the nominee, I'd probably have an equally large set of concerns. I think it is very clear that Bernie Sanders can win this election. And anyone who says he can't both slept through 2016 and has looked at none of the limited data that is available to us right now, so he absolutely can win it. But anyone who tells you that Bernie Sanders labeled himself a democratic socialist with the positions that he has does not make him a vulnerable Democratic nominee is also, I think, being naive about this. So he can win. He is going to have to run an incredible campaign, which the primaries indicated he is most certainly capable of, to navigate this fundamental question about socialism, because you have this, and I think it's very important to understand how it's going to play itself out in the election, which is you see a lot from some of the DSA people on Twitter or some of the other lefties who are behind Bernie saying, well, look at Bernie's policies. His policies are popular. You know, if we test Medicare for all, we can get it to, generically very popular. With some details, we can get it to even. We can survive that. Free college is popular. Bernie's positions are popular. But socialism is not about ideology. It's about identity. And what they're going to try to do is make Bernie Sanders seem scary and un-American. It's the exact play they tried to run against Obama in 2008 and in 2012. It is what Madrasas is about. It's about what Reverend Wright was about.
Bill Ayers.
Bill Ayers, not putting your hand on your heart, no flag pin. That's all. That's what they're going to do to Bernie. And I think Bernie could learn some lessons from how Obama was able to blunt that. And, and I think, Bernie did the 60 Minutes interview last night where which I thought he did very well in a lot of ways, despite, as you've pointed out, a complete freak out about some of the things he said. He had a hesitancy to tell his own story. And I think the Obama lesson is the best way to combat Republican attack ads who try to make you scary is to be able to tell your story in a way that firmly roots it in the American tradition, which I think Bernie Sanders' story is, if he is willing to tell that story both on the stump and in ads.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, look, I think there is plenty of political science research, data that shows ideologically candidates that are further to the ideological right and left have a harder time winning elections. People say, well, we have Donald Trump as president. You look at polls, you look at data after 2016, and a lot of voters did not see him as ideologically extreme on a number of issues, partly because he lied to us about Medicare, Social Security. He lied to us about how he was going to raise taxes on hedge fund managers, all this kind of stuff. So he lied to make himself appear more ideologically inconsistent than maybe your typical Republican. And I think if you look back at 2018, the candidates who were further to the left, a lot of the Justice Democrats-backed candidates, did not succeed in the midterm elections in red and purple states. That is just a fact. But the reason that so I have all those concerns as well. If Bernie Sanders wins, and I agree with Dan that he can win, it will be because he has somehow separated, so he doesn't seem like your typical leftist candidate. And then you look at some candidates who are more progressive that did win in 2018, right? Like Tammy Baldwin, Medicare for All supporter, first lesbian member of the Senate, runs in Wisconsin, wins by 11 points in a really tough state that Donald Trump won, where Tony Evers, the Democratic governor, only won by a point. So learn lessons from Tammy Baldwin. How did she do that? Sherrod Brown. Ohio was slipping away from the Democrats, and Sherrod Brown still crushed that state. Learn from Sherrod Brown. Katie Porter in Orange County. She's a Medicare for All supporter. Elizabeth Warren protege. She wins in a very red county, and she's a progressive. And when you talk to these candidates, and again, I did on The Wilderness, and you can listen, one of the reasons that they won despite their policy positions is they presented themselves as tough economic populists who didn't talk a lot about some of the more social and cultural positions that they've taken on the left, even though they still held those positions. And, they organized, they introduced themselves to voters. Like you said, Dan, they told their personal story. Like, there are a lot of things you can do to present yourself as an acceptable choice. Like, my whole mantra for this whole thing is, like, Bernie Sanders should become Sherrod Brown if he runs in the general election. And he should run as an economic populist and also take care to make sure that the election is about economic populism and being an outsider and being independent, and that the election is not about democratic socialism, which is what the Republicans want it to be about.
Bernie Sanders can win, but he will not win if the Democratic Party does not develop an inner fucking monologue.
I mean,
there's a self-perpetuating nature of having this public panic right now. And look, we should have a debate about Bernie Sanders' electability. He is not the nominee yet, right? Like, that is a fair question for the other campaigns to raise about Bernie Sanders, because it is the elephant in the room. But if he becomes our nominee, we are either going to hang together or we're all going to hang separately, like potentially literally. And so we're only going to win this united. And so people, I think, have to, even if he's not your chosen candidate, we got to get on board.
Yeah.
The really other smart conventional wisdom thing that people are saying now is, Democrats are going to lose the House if Bernie Sanders is the nominee. And yes, if someone does poorly at the top of the ticket, it can be a drag. But Chris Matthews decided to go back to France for his history lesson. I'd like to point to 1972, which was the worst electoral defeat in history of the country. Richard Nixon won 49 states with 61% of the popular vote. But Republicans lost 2 seats in the Senate, and they gained a dozen seats in the House, but the Dem majority was 243 to 192. So my point is just different time, different era, but this is complicated. It's hard to predict. Voters can split tickets. So just everyone stop predicting the biggest doom and gloom you can possibly think of.
Yeah, and again, we don't have a ton of data, but we have some limited data that I think we can learn from. There's already some evidence that people don't necessarily see Bernie as your typical left-wing candidate, right? So you go to polls and you ask people, would you vote for a socialist? Is that a problem? And the vast majority of Americans say no, they don't want to vote for socialists. That would really worry them. And yet, Bernie Sanders has the highest favorability ratings of anyone in the Democratic field right now. And he has some of the highest favorability ratings among the general electorate than any of the other Democrats right now. I think he's close to Joe Biden. In many polls, he's doing better than Joe Biden on favorability in the general electorate. And, again, nearly 100% of voters know who Bernie Sanders is. He ran for president before, so he is not some left-wing candidate who just came out of the blue and started running for president, and you can define him like he has defined himself to an extent. And again, if you look at the Real Clear Politics averages of all the candidates against Trump right now, Bernie is 4.4 points ahead of Trump. Biden is 4.3. Bloomberg is 3.3. Pete's 1.8. Warren's 1.8. Klobuchar's 1.7. Again, general election matchup polls aren't super predictive when you have a candidate who's not as well known, like a Pete, a Warren, a Klobuchar, people like that. But Bernie and Biden both have near 100% name ID, and Bernie is still, close in that, and in some of the swing states as well.
I think part of this freak out is we don't get to run an experiment where we see what happens after $1 billion is dumped on the heads of our nominee.
Right.
We don't get to see it, right?
No.
We have to pick and go in with the person we think is best able to win. And I think there are people, right? I think undergirding a lot of what we're hearing, and whether it's James Carville saying basically take Putin. I agree with Putin, right, that you don't say that part of it, but that's what he means. He thinks Putin's right about Bernie. It's not that he cares that Putin has this opinion. It's that he thinks he's right. Is this assumption that the attacks, that $1 billion spent is going to hurt Bernie more than it would Joe Biden or some of the other candidates. And I just don't know that to be true, and nobody does. Nobody does. That's all.
The point, like all the data points you offer about Bernie Sanders' popularity are very valid, and Democrats should feel good about that. It does speak to the very important and large task before the Sanders campaign, if he's the nominee, is that large swaths of voters don't know that Bernie Sanders is a socialist. According to some polling, 40% of Democratic voters don't know that. And so when you get to the voters who are going to decide this election in general, it's not like they've decided that it's not like they know Bernie Sanders identifies as a Democratic socialist, but like him anyway. There are a lot of who like him but don't know that fact, and so you have to get ahead of that with aggressive messaging.
Yeah, and that's the big challenge. But you're right. Like, look, the Republican campaign against the Democratic nominee is going to look completely different depending on who it is. But you can go through all of these candidates and talk about the scary scenario of what the ads will target. And right, for a Joe Biden or a Pete Buttigieg, it's probably not, or Mike Bloomberg, it's not going to be ideology. It's not going to be your too far left wing, or at least that's not going to work as well because voters don't see them as super left wing like they do Bernie. A campaign against Warren would probably be similar to Bernie, though she doesn't call herself a democratic socialist, which is a big difference. But she's taken a lot of the same positions as Bernie Sanders as well. So, it depends on the candidate. But Joe Biden's the nominee. We're going to hear more about Hunter and more about all this stuff and more about the Ukraine fucking bullshit. And none of it's going to be fair. None of it's going to be true. But that's going to be Biden's thing. There'll be a whole bunch of things for Pete. So like you said, Lovett, you just don't know what's going to work better on different candidates.
Well, here's what we do know. We do know which candidates have run great campaigns and which candidates have shown themselves live and able to adjust based on what's happening in the race, right?
Yeah.
And I think we undercount just how good a politician Bernie Sanders is sometimes and just how effective he is. And by the way, just how much stronger a candidate he's become in the 4 years since he ran in 2016. No one knows what the future holds, but it is amazing how many people have taken the last 48 hours to confirm every bias they had long before Bernie Sanders even announced he was running for president.
So on the debate stage, if you are what's your strategy if you're Biden, Pete, Warren, or Bloomberg, which are basically the people who possibly could have a path, I think?
Well, look, Mayor Pete just tweeted out some criticism in a clip of Bernie Sanders talking about Cuba. So it does seem like he views this as a potential path to attack Bernie going forward, maybe at the debate. It's worth pointing out that, the Trump administration has made a concerted effort to reach out to Cubans and Venezuelans in Florida. I think it's probably one of the savvier political things they've done over the past 3 years, and it's created challenges for Democrats there. That said, you can be critical of Fidel Castro in the Cuban regime and their human rights violations and everything else, and then also point out that they've been able to educate young people and develop a great medical care community and lots of doctors without becoming a communist, right? There's this unhinged absurdity where the American exceptionalism dictates that we can only viciously attack any other country that disagrees with us, when the reality is Barack Obama said very similar things when he visited Cuba during the rapprochement at the end of the second term.
It's so, first of all, we can't have a politics in which you can't note that one of the dangers of authoritarianism is that it offers things to people, which it sometimes entrenches its power. You need to be able to have an honest conversation about how these regimes take hold. And I would also point out that a lot of the people being very critical of Bernie have said wonderful things about Saudi Arabia, or said wonderful things about China, or denied, Bloomberg has denied that China is a dictatorship. There is a long list of hypocritical remarks by a ton of people currently criticizing Bernie for this. And, do I think that this is a danger area for Bernie Sanders? Anytime he's going to be asked about socialist or especially communist regimes that have been immiserating and cruel to its people, to their people. He is going to have to be very careful in how he answers that question. That said, we do not need to play the game of what Republicans will surely do. People like Marco Rubio already filming a little fucking TikTok in his car to criticize Bernie Sanders because it's an easy punch for him to throw. So that's all I have to say about that.
Yeah, look, it's definitely a challenge for him, and it's especially a challenge for him in Florida. The focus group I did there in Miami, I was surprised how many voters said that socialism was such a big problem. It was such a concern for them. Latino voters said this to me. They said it about Bernie Sanders. And so he's got a lot of work to do there to fix that. But I think on this specific comment, you can definitely over-torque stuff, right? And a lot of people, and people have. You can say that because, a lot of people pointed out that Barack Obama said something similar, and then everyone's like, well, he said that in his last year. He didn't say that when he was trying to run for office. But also, he did run for office in 2008 talking about an opening with Cuba, which was not super popular with some of these same people at the time.
Also, can you guys just clarify your jingoism? Is it because it's bad policy to be nice to communists, or is it an electability question?
Right,
we're all over the map.
Where are we coming from here?
Hey, when you do a bad faith attack on Bernie Sanders, you do me a favor. Keep it consistent.
Clarify.
All right? All right. Just keep that bad faith message limited and focused.
But to Dan's point, having a couple of members of Congress in Florida immediately jump on the story, retweet what Bernie said, along with stupid cat gifs and or criticism of Bernie, it's you don't have to lead with your chin here, guys. You can not tweet.
Yeah.
That might work.
Dan, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with everything you guys said. I think that the reaction to this was totally over-torqued, and this is the environment in which people are going to have to make the argument against Bernie. And the argument I think really boils down to is, and I'm not saying that this argument is correct. It might be. It might not be. No one knows. But is that Bernie is the riskiest choice. And are you willing to go with the riskiest choice in the most important election in the history of the planet?
Right.
And that's the case that Biden and Buttigieg and Warren and Klobuchar and Bloomberg and everyone else are going to have to make if they want to have any success.
And what do you think is Bernie's smartest strategy in this debate? Because there's also a history of people who are the front runners sort of resting on their laurels and then getting caught. And what are you trying to do if you're Bernie Sanders at this debate?
Survive. I think what he hopes to do is demonstrate to voters who like Bernie Sanders, because he is the most popular Democrat on that stage in much of the polling, demonstrate that he can handle the incoming, which he has not had to do in any sustained way in any debate yet, which is sort of mind-boggling because he's been winning for the last 6 debates. But if he looks like he can handle those attacks and brush them off and gives voters the opportunity to imagine him doing that with Trump, he will come out of the debate in the same position he went in, which is a prohibitive frontrunner for the Democratic nomination.
I will say, though, Dan, I think that's right. I think that he has probably faced a disproportionate lack of attacks at these debates, but that doesn't mean he hasn't faced hits. Pete has taken shots at him. Warren has taken shots at him. Bloomberg, certainly the last debate, tried. And I do think it is Bernie's strengths as a candidate, how easily he moves from those attacks into a broader, bigger message about what he's for, and he does that really successfully. And I think that's it. Of all the candidates who have a job to do at the debate, I do think his is the easiest. He needs to make a big, appealing case. He needs to seem like the front runner. And I think if he did what he did during the Bloomberg debate, I thought was incredibly effective. The debate before that, he took a question about his liabilities and turned into a big case for his movement, multi-generational, multi-ethnic movement of Americans, of working people. And so every time he does that, I think he makes his case stronger. So, I
think he's just going to say, Amy, I disagree with what Pete was saying about you earlier, and then just kind of drift away.
Also, by the way, if Bloomberg comes to this debate loaded for bear to take on Bernie Sanders, I mean, man, could Bernie Sanders have picked a better enemy? I mean, that's what happened with Warren last time. I don't think it's a bad thing if Bloomberg has a bunch of fucking canned lines in his rucksack that he pulls out and throws at Bernie Sanders. I don't think that hurts Bernie Sanders.
I think it does only if the other candidates on stage decide to piggyback on Bloomberg. They let Bloomberg take the lead, and then they say, "Well, I agree with the mayor on this one." That which you could see happening. Look, I think the best thing for him to do with this debate is start pivoting to look like and present himself as a general election candidate. I think in one of these stories about sort of the Democratic freakout in the Washington Post, they talked to Ro Khanna, who's on Pod Save the World before, and he was one of Bernie's earliest congressional endorsers, and he was talking about sort of the down ballot challenge. Everyone's worried that Bernie's going to sort of drag down the rest of the ticket if he's the nominee. And Khanna said he's going to build a coalition through persuasion and a grassroots movement, and he's going to give people the ability to depart on issues if they are representing their districts. He's a person who recognizes the value of intellectual dissent, which Bernie Sanders coming off like that is great. That's one of the ways to sort of give some people who are on the edges of this coalition some comfort. And then Khanna was also saying about some of his platform as well. He goes, you can talk about these issues in a way that is pro-economic growth. You can talk about these policies in a way that is pro-business. Now, there's a lot of Bernie Sanders supporters online who would not like hearing something like that. But I think Bernie gets that. I think his campaign gets that. I think a lot of people who are supporting him understand that. And I think he should take Ro Khanna's advice on both of those things.
I'd also just, look, I think there's going to be a lot of fear-mongering about Bernie Sanders. There weren't executions at the town square in Burlington, Vermont. You know what I mean? Like he's a practical person.
He's a low bar there, Lovett.
No, I'm saying that was a liability. I think there probably should have been. But, the other thing he's done in these debates, which I think has also made, honestly, it's ingratiating. I've appreciated personally. I do think it's the right thing to do, is he's always talked about the importance of coming together at a party and how we will unite behind the nominee, no matter who that is. It makes him seem bigger. It makes him seem like the leader of the party, and which, as of right now, he is.
I mean, being anti-establishment is a powerful force in any election. It worked for us in 2008. Yep. It's worked for Howard Dean for a while in 2004. It's been working for Bernie Sanders. When we were at his rally in Vegas, when he said, "I've got news for the Democratic establishment, they can't stop us," that was his biggest applause line. And then when he tweeted it, there was a meltdown in upper income parts of Washington, D.C. like nothing I've ever seen before. And look, I do think in the next days, weeks maybe, Bernie should transition away from that kind of rhetoric and just try to be more inclusive, because ultimately this is about building a bigger coalition. I tweeted a mild critique of Bernie's speech after Nevada caucus night and just got hammered by, DSA-based blue check marks for tone policing him. But at some point, I do think we have to reach out to some of these disaffected voters who went Trump. We cannot win without them. And so thinking through all the best ways to reach them is important.
I think he made a good start at that in his speech in Nevada. Look, we have seen that when you ask people what they want in a presidential candidate in the Democratic electorate, number one in a lot of these polls is bringing the country together. And, Bernie in that speech, and we played the clip earlier, said, Donald Trump and the Republican Party are going to try to divide us. They try to divide us. Race, class, gender, they pit us against each other. Our movement is about bringing people together. That is a very powerful message. It is not some kind of centrist, mushy message. It is about working class solidarity, which is what Bernie's movement is about. And I think if he starts speaking that message and really getting it out there, I do think it will start helping to bring people together and give some people some comfort.
And I do think it's about defining solidarity not just against Trump. And it's something that Bernie does really well. It's actually, if you want to see the most, I think, moving and uniting message Bernie Sanders offers, I think it's both a part of his speech that he often gives, but also in his ads that are these incredibly moving, multiracial ads about coming together and the power of the moment. And when Bernie says, look at the person next to you, think of the stranger.
Yeah.
Are you willing to fight for them as hard as you're willing to fight for yourself?
Very powerful.
I think sometimes we get into the politics, we get into the electability argument, and then you look at all of these millions of young people who have come behind Bernie Sanders and believe in Bernie Sanders. And I think it's important to see that positive vision of what he's offering and how exciting it is to people and how motivating it is for millions of people who see hope in Bernie Sanders. And I think if he can show other people who aren't yet on board why so many young people feel that hope, I think that he'll be president.
Yeah. But again, it is on the Bernie Sanders campaign to do that. It is on his supporters to do that. Running a campaign, like, he has a lot of vulnerabilities, and it takes incredible discipline to run a campaign in any environment, let alone this environment. And there is very little room for error. And so that is, that is partially the source of some of the freakout here. But and I think we have all said that the freakout is way too much. But on the other side of this, let's not minimize the challenge here.
And I do think the person who gets that better than anyone is Bernie Sanders.
Yes.
He's a smart, savvy politician that won repeatedly in a state that leans culturally conservative in a lot of ways. He's talked to these people before. He'll figure it out.